Thank you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 webinar Wednesday series. We're coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email him directly at the contact information you'll see on the last slide. All right, that's just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services to federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do offer advertising in our newsletter, so feel free to reach out to us, and we'll get back to you on that. Our speaker today is Ed Delisle, and he's going to be covering simplified acquisitions, how, why, and when the government uses them. Thank you for joining us today, Ed. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining this afternoon. Our topic this afternoon is simplified acquisitions, how, why, and when government uses them. Mallory, if you could advance the slide. Okay, by virtue of its name, the idea as to simplified acquisitions is to make purchases less complicated than they would otherwise be for the government agency that is attempting to procure a good or service, as well as for those who wish to sell to those particular government agencies. By way of definition, what is it? It's a purchase by a government agency which does not exceed the simplified acquisition threshold, or SAT. Mallory, if you can advance the slide. So what is the simplified acquisition threshold? It's the financial ceiling for use of simplified acquisition procedures. If you take a look at FAR Part 13 as it's currently constituted, you'll see a range of 3,500, which is the micro purchase threshold that's identified in the current version of the FAR, and 150,000, which is the simplified acquisition threshold. And what we're really talking about today, now that's a little bit deceiving because back in 2017 and then again in 2018, the National Defense Authorization Act, Congress instructed that the thresholds be increased. In a proposed rule that was issued in October of this year, the FAR Council recommended, issued a rule that would raise the levels to where Congress wished them to be, which is what we see here on the slide, $10,000 from the micro purchase threshold level to $250,000, which is, for all intents and purposes, the current simplified acquisition threshold. Most agencies have been using the $250,000 SAT, as it's called. The Civilian Agency Acquisition Council, back in February of 18, issued what it called a deviation and indicating that its agencies, civilian agencies, should start using the higher threshold level of $250,000. And immediately thereafter, GSA began, in March of 2018, they began to use it. Department of Defense began to use the $250,000 SAT in the fall of 2018. So while we don't have a final rule changing the FAR officially to $250,000, most agencies have been using it for some time. In the study that was issued with the proposed rule back in October, FAR Council indicated that had the higher threshold level been used between 2015 and 2018, hundreds of millions of additional dollars would have been spent by the government using the simplified acquisition procedures, which for lots of different reasons, it can be argued would have been better for both government and for contractors, including small business. Okay, Mallory, if you can advance the slide. Okay, so when will agencies use it? As we talked about just moments ago, they'll use it based upon monies being spent between the ranges of $10,000 and $250,000. That's for both goods and services. The procedures that are currently in FAR Part 13, which is where you'll find them, have been in place for all intents and purposes since 1994 with the passage of the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of 1994. That act was passed for the purposes of making things easier both on government and contractor in terms of both buying things and selling things, depending upon whose perspective you're looking at it from. What does the annual spend under SAP look like? Mallory, if you could advance the slide. Okay, so this is interesting. This is what it looks like. When FASA went into place in 1994, about $50 million worth of goods and services were purchased by the government using the simplified acquisition procedures that were in place at that time. The SAP at that time was changed, okay, to make it more likely, easier for the government to use simplified acquisition procedures. And look what happened. You went from 50 million to 219 million just from 1994 to 1995. This is just purchases for using the simplified acquisition procedures. And then it jumped big time again from 1995 to 1996, from 219 million to 2.3 billion. That's a big jump. And you'll see that that jump continued over the course of time. In fact, you have more than a 50% increase in the use of the simplified acquisition procedures in terms of dollars spent from 2010 to 2019. And the figures from 2019 could be a little bit off because there's a lag in the reporting of the Department of Defense. There's about a 30-day lag for security reasons. And so that $25 billion that you see there for 2019 is probably it's more than that for sure. How much more? It's a little hard to say. But what this I hope shows businesses that are listening, in particular small business, this has become a much more common procedure, and it's something, if you're a small business, that you should consider as part of your arsenal in terms of winning government work. Okay, Mallory, if you could advance the slide. Okay, so in terms of when an agency will use simplified acquisitions, they'll use the SAP to buy all sorts of things. Taking a look at the NAICS code, the NAICS, everybody will probably know, but the North Atlantic Industry Classification System, government uses that, for lots of different purposes in terms of identifying size thresholds in particular, but they identify different industries. And if you take a look at the types of goods and services based upon NAICS code that the government purchases, you're going to see 3 of the top 5 here, and this is from 2019. Aircraft parts, auxiliary equipment, 1.3 billion. Software publishers, that's at least how the NAICS has identified it. In a lot of these cases, you can have both goods and services under a particular NAICS code. You could look at a product service code to determine more specifically exactly what was purchased, but this will at least provide some idea as to how the government uses SAP to buy things. Administrative management and consulting, 550 million so far this year. And that's what you're seeing here is out of a total spend of about 25 billion, that all of which has been purchased using simplified acquisition procedures. Okay, Mallory, if you can advance the slide. All right, so which agencies use these procedures? Pretty much all of them. You see here 71 departments. Here are the top 4 that I've identified, and this is now 17 billion just spent using simplified acquisition procedures in 2019. So you have Commerce, Defense, Justice, and Veterans Affairs that spend the most using these particular procedures. So what does that tell you as a business? That you have the ability within these financial constraints, these dollar values, this dollar range, $10,000 to $250,000, to win a lot of work if you bid to these companies, if you can sell a good or service falling within that monetary range. So hopefully this information provides some understanding as to who's using these procedures when they buy. Okay, if we can advance the slide. Why do they use them? We talked a little bit about this already in connection with FASA and the passage of FASA. It reduces cost. It reduces cost from the government's perspective because it doesn't have to, for example, use the same marketing techniques that it would use if, for example, it was seeking goods or services through the use of FAR Part 15, which is contracting by negotiation. It does not have to perform the same sort of evaluation process that it would have to go through if, for example, it purchased something using FAR Part 15. So it makes it easier for the government, and from the contractor's perspective, it's more efficient and easier because, for example, you don't have as many requirements to respond. It's less expensive for a contractor to submit a quote or to respond to an RFP, a request for proposal, and provide information only with respect to, for example, past performance, which when the government engages in a SAP process, a Simplified Acquisition Procedure process, if it does use an RFP as part of its means of obtaining a service, for example, past performance is typically all that it'll ask for. It has broad discretion, as we'll get into in a little bit, to consider other evaluation factors, but usually there aren't that many, and most of the time it's past performance. It makes it easier on the contractor to respond to something like that. So it's easier for the contractor, it's easier for the government. It's also good for both government and contractor because it creates opportunities for small business. How does it do that? Well, we'll talk about that momentarily, but that's great for government because from the government's perspective, there are small business goals which agencies have done a better job of attaining in recent history. And part of the reason why they've had an easier time doing so is the increased use of simplified acquisition procedures. Now, if you could advance the slide. So in terms of assistance to small business, as set forth in FAR Part 13, anything that the government purchases between the micro-purchase threshold of $10,000 and the simplified acquisition threshold, $250,000, is exclusively reserved for small business. That's great for small business, and it's great for small businesses of all types: service disabled veteran-owned, woman-owned, hub zone, straight small business. All companies falling within those socioeconomic categories are benefiting from the increased use of simplified acquisition procedures. In part, that's because FAR Part 19 has been incorporated into FAR Part 13, identifying the use of all of these different types of small businesses as part of how the government buys. Okay, now if you could advance the slide. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, you'll find these procedures in FAR Part 13. FAR Part 13 is exclusively for simplified acquisition procedures and how they work. The one that I would recommend to folks that aren't all that familiar with how it works is the first one identified there, 13.000-006. That is where you'll see the purpose and policy of the procedures identified, and they're a bit more general and less technical and easier to understand. Everything that's discussed in there is, in fact, discussed in more detail further down into that section of the FAR. There are 5 sections in total. I mentioned 3 here because they're the most important. One that I don't mention here, but I'll mention now, is FAR 13 subpart 5, so 13.5, which talks about simplified acquisitions for commercial items. It's a little bit different when it comes to certain commercial items that can be purchased in bulk in the commercial marketplace for an easily identified price. There's a market price for a good that's commonly found. For goods like that that are considered commercial items under the government's definition, the threshold is $7 million. So it's much higher than the $250,000 threshold that is identified for the use of other goods and services. And it's higher because of the ease with which items like that can typically be purchased, and the idea is that there should be less burden in terms of government being able to purchase goods that fall into that category. If the government is buying commercial items for or in connection with a contingency operation, so there's a terrorist attack of some kind or something like that, then the threshold level goes up even further to $13 million. Okay, Mallory, if you can advance the slide. Okay, so what are the procedures? We're continuing with that. Okay, so FAR Part 13 provides the contracting officer with broad discretion to determine what procedures he or she wants to use. And unlike FAR Part 15, contracting by negotiation, it's the contracting officer that's making these decisions. It's not a source selection authority where you might have a number of people involved. It's the contracting officer. What must the contracting officer do when it engages in a simplified acquisition process? Well, it must make sure that the government only buys what it needs, and it has to be at a reasonable price. Buying in bulk is okay, but you have to do it within reason. If the contracting officer wants to eliminate an offer provided by a small business, it has to make sure that it satisfies FAR 19.6. Generally speaking, under these procedures, a contracting officer is supposed to consider all offers made or all proposals submitted. But if it does decide it wants to eliminate a small business from competing for a particular good or service, or providing a particular good or service, it has to engage the Small Business Administration as part of that process. And FAR 19.6 has been incorporated into FAR Part 13 to ensure that that happens. A contracting officer also must provide for inspection of supplies and services as part of any solicitation that is issued under the Simplified Acquisition Procedures. Okay, Mallory, if you could advance the slide. What must a contracting officer not do as part of using the Simplified Acquisition Procedure process? It can't solicit quotes based upon his or her own personal preference. If the contracting officer likes a particular good, bounty paper towels, for example, it cannot limit a solicitation to that. The idea is to promote competition to the maximum extent practicable, as we see here. That's taken right out of the FAR, and beyond the other issues which may arise by injecting personal preference into things in order to adhere to this whole tenet of promoting competition. Issuing a solicitation pertaining to a particular brand, it wouldn't work. And the idea is that if the purpose is fulfilled by something of a different type or brand, or even quality to a certain extent, then the contracting officer has to take that into consideration and do what he or she can to see that competition is promoted, and personal preference isn't going to do it. Restricting the solicitation to well-known or widely distributed makes or brands typically isn't going to fit the bill, and so that, generally speaking, won't be permitted. Mallory, if you can advance the slide. How does it go about its business, that is the contracting officer, in terms of implementing these procedures? Well, what they'll do is, as a primary resource, they'll look at the system for award management to see if the good or service that he or she wishes to procure can be provided by businesses that are found through SAM. If you're a small business, for this reason, for lots of other reasons, but for this reason in particular, you want to make sure that your representations and certifications are up to date, and that if you're a small business of a particular type, that's identified in the system for award management. The contracting officer can use other information at his or her disposal too. The agency may keep records, it probably does, of things that it's purchased in the past, and who it's purchased it from, and at what price. And contracting officers will often use that information as part of their market research to determine whether or not seeking competition in a particular way under these procedures makes sense and whether or not there's sufficient competition to do so. If anything that the contracting officer wishes to purchase under these procedures is in excess of $25,000, then as part of this process, prior to buying that good or service, a synopses of what it's seeking needs to appear online in some way. It used to be that you get it through Federal Business Opportunities. Now, generally speaking, you're going to get it through the System for Award Management. Okay, Mallory, if you can advance the slide. Okay, so the FAR under FAR Part 13 encourages contracting officers as part of the SAP process to use a best value selection process. I can tell you, generally speaking, that doesn't happen. Generally speaking, and we'll get into this in a few moments, they're going to use an RFQ process, but if they use an RFP process and incorporate best value selection, they can do that. We talked about past performance a little bit earlier. That's when they incorporate best value, that's usually what they'll do. If they do decide to use best value as part of the simplified acquisition procedure process, they don't have to tell you what's most important as far as factors or sub-factors are concerned. If there are multiple factors or sub-factors that will play into the selection process, they have to tell you what they will be considering, but they don't have to tell you which particular factor is more important than another. And as I say here, most of the time, you're going to be dealing with more of an RFQ process or a request for quotation seeking price as opposed to an RFP process. We'll talk about that a little more in a minute or two. All right, Mallory, if you can advance the slide. Okay, so I get this a lot. Okay, if the government issues an RFQ as part of a SAP process, hey, do I have a contract? The short answer to that is no, you don't. RFQs are different than RFPs, and you need to understand that. If the government asks for a quotation and you provide a price, then that's something for the government to consider, but that doesn't mean that you have a contract with the government. Now, what will happen is the government will issue, typically it's either a purchase order or it could be a blanket purchase agreement in response to an RFQ, and then the vendor, the contractor, has an opportunity to enter into a contract with the government for the good or service that's been identified in that purchase order or blanket purchase agreement. That's the way the RFQ system generally works. Normally, these offers are made in writing, not always. There are instances where a contracting officer will engage in oral communication with a prospective contractor or vendor. That does happen. If you are a contractor or a vendor and that's the process that's being employed by a contracting officer, make sure that you have something in writing indicating what the deal is, what was agreed upon, and that sort of thing, just to make sure if anything happens later, you have some sort of record of it. Okay, if we can advance the slide. Okay, so if you are engaging with the government in this SAP process, do you have to accept an offer from the government in writing? So if the government does issue you a purchase order or a blanket purchase agreement, for example, do you have to accept it in writing? Probably, but not necessarily. It depends. It depends what it says. Action can constitute acceptance in certain circumstances. If there's no requirement that written acceptance be provided, then actually supplying the good or service can count. Substantially performing the work relative to a service can count. I would be careful if you're a contractor and you're not sure. I would pick up the phone, call the contracting officer, and at least find out what the contracting officer's perspective is on that, regardless of what the writing says. Okay, if we can advance the slide. Can they be modified or canceled? The answer is yes. So if a purchase order or a BPA is issued by the government, they can modify or cancel it at any time. Okay. There are circumstances where a contractor, if something's canceled, can obtain costs associated with that cancellation, and that you can see the FAR reference there relative to that. If it was a FAR Part 15 solicitation, that kind of thing does happen way more often, but you can also have it occur in a situation under FAR Part 13, and there is the possibility of being compensated for that under certain circumstances. Okay, if we can advance the slide. What if the government does decide to use an RFP and incorporate a best value procedure as part of a SAP process? Well, as we talked about a little bit earlier, the government has a broad discretion in terms of determining what the appropriate evaluation factors are. It doesn't have to tell you how important one is versus the other, and as part of the process, as long as it's identified in the solicitation, the contracting officer can virtually take into consideration whatever it desires as part of this best value evaluation. You can see here, and this is taken right from FAR Part 13, it can consider any other reasonable basis to judge who to provide the contract to. Okay, we can advance the slide.
Hey, Ed, we're actually going to have to wrap up so that way we're on time for the next webinar. So if you have any questions on anything he said, please feel free to send him an email or phone or call him at the phone number shown on your screen. Thank you. This concludes the webinar.
Thank you.